The grand solar minimum and Bible prophecy, I really start to think that these things have a connection as I've started to look into them. Well, I've always looked into prophecy, but as I've come to know and learn more of the grand solar minimum, I think these things truly have a connection. So what we know is that the Earth goes in cycles, solar minimums and solar maximums, and within solar maximums, the sun is cooler, therefore the Earth is cooler, and the sunspots on the sun are not as active, therefore cooling the Earth, therefore making things harder to grow. And we've seen things like the mini ice age and the Maunder minimum. Right now we are heading into the Eddy minimum with the next solar minimum, with different predictions saying different timelines, but for sure 2030, I believe around 2038. But then there's different predictions. I've heard people say this is going to be a 400-year solar minimum, different things. But what we do know just by looking at the activity on the sun and the past cycles, we were in maximums and go into minimums, and we are currently going into another minimum. So with the minimums comes, like I mentioned, harder times to grow food. It makes it harder to grow crops when it's cooler, early frosts, early winter, late winters, things of that nature. And just like we've seen the flooding and the pretty incredible weather around the world really affecting the corn growth here in the United States and in China. And what we see from that is food increases, the price of food increases, as well as it's harder to grow food. So there's a food shortage. And when we look at Bible prophecy, it's pretty interesting to see the correlation between the two. And so many other things within Bible prophecy are taking place right now. If you read Matthew 24, it talks about the times before the end times, and so many of those things are starting to take place. Truly like the beginning of sorrows, which is what I believe that we are currently in, or in the beginning stages of that. It seems like that. When you read Matthew 24, it really does. Or especially 2 Timothy 3, I'll quickly read and then get into the prophecies that are in connection to the grand solar minimum. But 2 Timothy 3 says, "For this know also, that in the last days perilous times shall come, for men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God." Clearly these things are taking place. So when we're told that's what the last days will look like, and we're seeing these things, there's a correlation. So when we look at the grand solar minimum that we're heading into, and then we look into such verses as Matthew 24:7, where it says, "For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in divers places." So we know that there'll be famines in the end times, shortages of food. Many times people link that to droughts, and nowhere in the Bible does it talk about these famines being linked to droughts, which one would think. But no, it just talks about famines in the end times. So what's another way that a famine could be created? Well, through less food being grown because of potentially the grand solar minimum. I mean, what's the other option really to where the famine could be caused? Would it be caused because due to different wars going on? So I guess areas where food is grown can't be grown, or people, resources are stretched thin, something like that potentially. But with us going into the grand solar minimum and other prophecies taking place, such as 2 Timothy 3, I mean, the list goes on and on. I'm going to make another video about that pretty soon, about all the prophecies that have been fulfilled and that are in the times that we live in right now. It's pretty incredible. But we're heading into the grand solar minimum, and so that could be the link to the famines that are coming. It's also interesting when you read in Mark 13, in verses 17 through 19, talking about in the end times. This is a parallel chapter to Matthew 24. It's just in the book of Mark in 13. And in 17 through 19 it says, "But woe to them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. And pray ye that your flight be not in the winter. For in those days shall be affliction, such as was not from the beginning of the creation which God created unto this time, neither shall be." So neither shall there ever be again the affliction that we will be facing, and that people who are on the earth in those times will be facing. So it's pretty interesting. In verse 18 it says, "And pray ye that your flight be not in the winter." Is that just because, well, obviously that would not be fun having to flee in the winter? Or is it because winter will be worse due to the grand solar minimums? I mean, look back at last year. I covered it many times. Record colds, record snows all throughout the entire world, not just one specific area or one fluke here and there. Every single continent saw record snows and record colds. So yeah, it would really not be cool to have to flee during the winter if it's a even harsher winter. And if we look to the parallel passage in Matthew 24 in verse 20, it says, "But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day." Verse 21, "For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor shall ever be." So there we have again in the parallel passage that you pray that your flight be not in the winter. Is that because the winter is going to be a lot harsher? Potentially. Pretty interesting. And lastly, here in the book of Revelation, in chapter 6, we have the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse starting to be talked about here, and we have the rider on the black horse. Here I'll read Revelation 6, 5 through 6, and this is what it says. "And when he had opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd beast say, Come and see. And I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the 4 beasts say, A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny. And see thou hurt not the oil and the wine." So this is talking about how much currency it will cost for a penny at that time. And when you look at what the correlation is to that time period and now, it's about a day's wage for a loaf of bread. So what's a loaf of bread cost now? Like $4 or $5? So think about what the average day's wage is. I don't know, 90 or close to 100, so $100 for a loaf of bread. I mean, that's absolutely incredible. I mean, clearly there's food shortages going on during that time due to famines and different things going on. And with a grand solar minimum and harder growing periods, here we have maybe a potential way that the reasons for why wheat and barley and different foods cost almost a day's wage. And the reason that the correlation between a day's wage is linked to that is because in that verse in Revelation, it says a measure of wheat for a penny. And when we look at Matthew chapter 20, verse 2, it says, "And when he had agreed with the laborers for a penny a day, he sent them into his vineyard." So that's the correlation between a penny for a whole day and then a penny for, a measure of barley, or for 3 measures of barley for a penny and a measure of wheat. And the Greek word for measure is chionyx, which is the equivalent to a dry quart. And a dry quart of wheat is approximately enough to make 1.5 to almost 2 loaves of 1 pound of bread for the average amount of bread a person living in the Roman Empire at the time ate per day. So that's where you get about a day's worth of bread for a day's wages. So it's pretty unbelievable. And some people have done the math a little differently to where it would come out to, if the minimum wage was around $7.50, then that would mean a loaf of bread would be $58, which is still absolutely unimaginable. That's why so many people have tried to inform people that it really is smart, no matter what the case is, whatever you believe, whether pre-trib, post-trib, whatever the case is, to prepare ahead of time and just to have extra stuff, that you can always fall back on in case, whatever the case is, because there's even, just local events and things that go on, massive storms and things of that nature, where it's good to have extra stuff to always fall back on. So it's pretty amazing, the different things that the Bible talks about, especially in Revelation, the amount that food will cost in the end times. And when you look at that, the fact that we're heading into this grand solar minimum where food will be harder to grow. I mean, we're already seeing it now. Corn in the United States as well as China is down like 40% of normal growing and normal production. So these things are already starting to take place. I mean, there's different articles, if you look around the world. This article from just a month ago, World Hunger on the Rise as 820 million at risk, UN report finds. So, and then emulating hunger by 2030 is an immense challenge, says heads of UN agencies. And they're more than full aware of the grand solar minimum. They like to blame things on climate change and warming, but as we saw last year, things got a lot colder and crops were affected due to the grand solar minimum. So with different prophecies being fulfilled all around us all the time, it's pretty incredible to see that this is potentially the famines. The famines that the world will be facing will be due to the grand solar minimum, all part of God's plan. I don't know, pretty interesting. We don't know. We just got to look at things. Jesus says, learn from the fig tree. When it starts to bud, that fruit is coming. So it's good to watch for the signs and to be prepared and to be ready for them. No man knows the day or the hour, like the Bible says as well. But it's important to pay attention to the signs, because in Matthew 24, like I just mentioned, Jesus says, look at the fig tree. When you see these things starting to take place, the same as when the fig tree is budding, that fruit is coming and that these things are starting to unfold. So be on the watch. I find it very interesting. Always good to keep watch. The most important thing you could ever do in any time, but especially the times that we live in, especially when the deceptions are so strong and different things going on. I mean, I heard something recently of different supposed Christian leaders renouncing their faith. Absolutely unreal. I mean, we're clearly living in and moving towards the end times. Probably the beginning of sorrows would be my bet. We don't know for sure. We just gotta always put our trust in Jesus no matter what. And that's the greatest thing you could ever do, is be right with him and follow his word. That is the most important thing in this time that we live in, and in any time, but especially now in the age of deception. When we live in the age of information, we still live in the age of deception. Interesting how that's going on. Thanks for watching. God bless.